Could Australia end up with a dictator or an autocratic government? There are bits in the Constitution that would protect us against that. Hello, I'm Anne Twomey. I'm a Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney. I taught constitutional law there for a long time. Constitution is essentially the rule book for Australia. It's the source of all law. Some of the things that would stop Australia from having a populist government are, first of all, compulsory voting. Has been really important to Australia because it takes out the extremes, because it means that the middle comes out to vote. And that's what you don't see in some other countries where you don't have compulsory voting. It's the people who are motivated who come out to vote, and they tend to be the people who are on the various extremes, and the middle doesn't tend to come out. Compulsory voting could be overturned in Australia. Well, at least we think so. Compulsory voting was brought in by legislation. It's not a requirement of the Constitution. But there have been suggestions in the High Court that over time, ability or the rights of voters have expanded, and that by bringing it back and getting rid of it would restrict the voting of people and therefore be unconstitutional. So there's an argument about that. Whether it would succeed, who knows? But in terms of popularity, compulsory voting is very popular in Australia, and it's unlikely that anyone would overturn it, at least in the short term. Our Constitution is different because, unlike many, we don't have a Bill of Rights in it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just that we deal with things differently. The American Constitution came out of revolution and distrust of government, and that's where you see things like the right to bear arms, for example, and freedom of speech. It's all about giving the individual rights against governments because there was that inherent distrust in government. The Australian Constitution came out in a completely different context. We don't have that sort of story of, give me liberty or give me death. Actually, we have people wanting to avoid tax, as embarrassing as it may be. People were just sick to death of paying taxes on goods as they crossed the border from one colony to another, and they hated it. And so people expect that our Constitution gives us all sorts of rights, but actually the rights in there are very few. And there's a reason for that, and that is that the people who wrote the Constitution thought, well, who in the end should decide about how we deal with rights when rights conflict? Your right to freedom of speech might conflict with your right to freedom of religion, for example, and someone needs to decide how to deal with the priority of rights when rights conflict. And there's a good point that that should be democratically elected politicians rather than unelected judges. We do have rights in Australia, but mostly they're rights that are set out in legislation or rights recognised by the common law. And that does mean that those rights can be adjusted and even taken away. Populist or autocratic governments tend to rise because some terrible event has happened. It might be a war or a risk of war or a natural disaster or something or other. And they're there saying, we are the only ones who are going to protect you. And how are you going to protect the people? Well, that sometimes involves taking away a lot of their rights. And that's the thing that we need to be really quite worried about. The High Court decided in 1992 that we have this implied freedom of political communication because it's necessary in order to make the Constitution function properly. Sometimes the Constitution will put things down expressly in writing and say, for example, that the two houses of Parliament have to be directly chosen by the people. Well, if the people are to directly choose their members of Parliament, then that choice has to be a genuine choice. And you can't have a genuine choice unless people are able to engage in conversation about criticism of government. There's nothing to stop the High Court from changing its view about that, and indeed there have been on the High Court a couple of judges who have been very critical of the implied freedom of political communication. But there have been, at times, unanimous decisions also supporting the implied freedom of political communication. So it's fairly unlikely that it would get overturned. You can't say it's impossible, but it is unlikely. Recently, quite a lot of laws in relation to hate speech have been enacted across Australia. So at the Commonwealth level, we've got laws about banning particular groups and banning slogans. At the state level, we've got laws that make it a criminal offence to incite racial hatred. And we're even looking now at laws that might ban particular slogans. So all of these things raise issues about the implied freedom of political communication. Whether or not they're unconstitutional remains to be seen because it's part of a balancing process the High Court does. There are risks that laws that allow, for example, banning organisations or banning their symbols, etc., could be abused in the future, and that's one of the things that worries me about these laws. They're drafted really broadly and vaguely in order to catch particular groups, But that just means that they could be abused in the future. And I worry about putting on our statute books something that is very vague and broad, and it could be used for purposes that are just not even imagined at the moment. So I think we need to be far more careful about narrowing them down to what we're really trying to achieve. If you were to have some kind of an autocrat or a dictator, you'd really need to control the High Court. In Australia, because we don't have an entrenched Bill of Rights, and the cases that go to the High Court cover a much broader variety of issues, and they're much more law-based rather than policy-based, the court itself is less politicised. One High Court judge pointed out that, she could walk down the street and go to the supermarket and nobody knew who on earth she was. In the United States, you'd find it much more difficult to do that because everybody knows who you are. It's the other thing that autocrats do, populists as well. They try and get rid of any restrictions on their powers. So if a court, for example, says, well, no, you can't do that, they'll say, oh, you're an activist judge, or you're a such and such lunatic. And so they'll disparage any of the institutions of government that place restrictions on their powers. They might disparage even Parliament and say, well, Parliament can't make laws about this because we are the executive, we came in with a mandate from the people, we can do what we like. Autocrats tend to rise when they use emergency powers that restrict people's movements or restrict their ability to communicate. I don't think you could impose martial law under the Constitution as it is. We're very lucky that there's no emergency provisions in the Constitution that can be exploited in that way. Many constitutions do have them, we do not. There is, however, a principle of emergency that can be used in extreme circumstances. Your country's been invaded, for example. Your members of Parliament have all been kidnapped and are being held hostage somewhere. Your Parliament's not able to function. Under our Constitution, has to be used to get you back to democracy. It can't be used just to put in place coup leaders or, people who want to abuse the system. It can only be used to go towards restoring democracy. If you trust Australian culture that supports the rule of law and you think we will keep heading down that direction, then the system that we have is great. But if you distrust that, and if you're concerned that we will head down a completely different track, then maybe an entrenched constitutional Bill of Rights is a good thing. The other side of it, however, and the one that does worry me a little bit, is, well, what does happen in the future if you end up with some kind of populist or authoritarian government and they do start trying to strip away people's rights? What if they control both houses of Parliament? What sort of ability is there to stop that? And that's the thing that we need to be conscious of as we see a rise of populist, authoritarian governments around the world, people saying that election and executive power means you can do what you want. We need to say, no, it doesn't. That's why we have laws. That's why we have institutions that are checks on government, because we want to make sure that that doesn't happen and we want to keep our democracy healthy. Because we do have a system of compulsory voting and we do have an independent High Court, and we do have some requirements in the Constitution that support that. And most of all, because we have a culture of acceptance of the rule of law, I think it's unlikely that we will see a rise of populist or authoritarian governments in Australia, because the good sense of the Australian people when they vote will stop that from happening. And there are constraints and limits on power. But I think with all of these things, we do still need to be vigilant. I do worry about what's happening in the rest of the world. There is a very great rise of populism and authoritarian governments in other parts of the world, and we won't necessarily be unaffected by that, but we need to be vigilant. We need to make sure that the statutes on our books cannot be abused in the future. We want to keep the door shut to that. I am hopeful for Australian democracy. I think the Australian people are very sensible and will ensure that they have continuing respect for the Constitution and the rule of law, and most of all for our democracy.